All right, so let's get started from the beginnings. Could you tell us a bit about what made you want to become a filmmaker and tell the stories that you tell in your films?
Well, I mean, it's hard because I don't even remember a time where I wouldn't have thought that I wanted to be using cameras and filming things and making up little stories. But from very early age, 12, 13, I anticipated getting to the high school that I would go because there in the high school was a cable access television studio that was run by students and broadcast throughout the town. It basically fulfilling the same function that the internet would today, that YouTube or Vimeo or things where it was just an actual, this is the late 90s, early 2000s, an actual outlet for filming things and a couple of thousand people seeing them, which felt real. So my dream before I even got to high school was to make things in that. There was a news show, local community news that was made by students and was run all weekend. And then once I got to school and was participating in this, filming things like talent shows, and older students that I looked up to started graduating high school and going away and going to film school. And this was very interesting to me because I had never really considered the world beyond growing up. And then suddenly it's clear that you can go to college and continue making movies. And at the same time, movies and watching things was becoming so much more accessible to me and to others. There were so many wonderful films that being made at that time, being released on video, and I was able to access them constantly, and the ability to be watching things and then making little projects and then seeing that there was this way to go to school for it all came together.
Were there any specific filmmakers or films that you were inspired by, or would you say were formative?
It was the independent films of the 90s at this time that I'm talking about. It's nothing that is obscure or difficult to talk about now, but it was Clerks and Pulp Fiction and Rushmore and 100 films that everybody knows and loves. But these were new movies to me that you would get on video, and for me and for millions of others, this very real and alive in a way that other things you were looking at were not. And I think people now sort of have reversed analyzed, saying now like 1999 was, this wonderful, miraculous year for movies. 50 great important films came out that year: Blair Witch Project and The Matrix and Fight Club and Virgin Suicides and all these other, people now say that's like a famous year of releasing movies. And to me, that was a year where I was seeing things in the theater 2 a weekend and then taking videos home as well. So to look back and say now there's this year that people regard as a sort of monumentally important year, Magnolia and Being John Malkovich, people now to say, oh, that's one of the most important years for personal, strange, idiosyncratic films. And I was just there for all of it. And this to me was just contemporary cinema. And it was so exciting. And 20 years retrospect, it's obvious that other people felt that way, but it was very alive at the time to go to both the multiplex or the art house or to be renting things at home.
Looking back now, would you say a piece of advice that you wish you had been given as a aspiring filmmaker, yeah, back in the late 90s?
At that time, well, no, because I hadn't even gone to college yet. So there was really no advice. I mean, I didn't take anything seriously. I was just making little, what would now just be YouTubes or social media videos that teenagers make. I was making them on VHS with my friends. It's exactly what seems to have evolved. But, the advice was just we were being silly and making silly little things and just having fun. And that was the whole point of it. And then the idea that it was to be taken seriously or treated like a career path or none of that mattered. It was just, this was our way to spend time together all night, all afternoon, and all weekend, just making things, going to places, coming up with ideas. And, the advice was just, there's nothing wrong with that. It seems like now millions more people are doing that now than were 20 years ago.
Do you still have those VHS films, and is there anything there that
Yeah, no, I have them. I have the tapes of a lot of them, and then a few years ago, my dad, who had all the tapes of the finished work of the show that my friends and I made. There's tapes at home of all 35 episodes. He had them converted at like a camera shop to DVD for me, so I have them.
to be used or rewatched at some point.
Yeah, I scrub through them time to time. I'm more just happy to have them than I am thinking that I need to do something with them.
Right.
Benefit for me is that none of this stuff was on the internet, which would mean that it's there forever in some way. So fortunately, it just exists
You
on
still
pieces of plastic around my home.
you still have control over it. If you want to, you can release it on the internet, but then you know it'll never disappear.
Yeah, no, we would have loved to have had YouTube and Vimeo and things like that to sort of force our pieces onto people. Because as it was, they would just air on the cable access channel and then you wouldn't be able to see them anymore unless we aired them again. And we would have loved to have made that permanent. And then later I would have been mortified that we had made it permanent. So I'm glad that it was all ephemeral.
Would you have any piece of advice for aspiring filmmakers or film students today?
I mean, the thing about the period I'm describing in high school and then in college, and then for me making movies beyond up to the present, even, the advice is it was for me only possible and only able to work because I was finding people to do it with. The advice was not thinking that I was able to create things all by myself. Of course, a lot of people have these lofty goals of like, I can write something and make it myself, I can edit it myself. The advice and this journey from making these little projects in high school to making feature films later is just always bringing in as many other people as possible to share the creative workload, and then most importantly having as many people who bring in ideas that are not the same as yours. And we had a core little unit making these video pieces in high school, and then this was something that I really struggled to find in college and didn't have in the same way that I would have liked. And I think suffered for it because you kind of need that. And I just never was able to really find it with the type of students that go to NYU. Had a very small group, but not big enough to really be the core creative circle. And then have spent years post college making several features, building that up again, and really feeling like whether it was four of us making movies on videotape or now making larger feature films, any attempt to do it all or to do more myself than I could handle is always the wrong choice.
But I read that, for example, you worked at Kim's Video Store in New York, and that's where you met Sean Price Williams and other collaborators of yours, and that you've worked with
Mhm.
throughout your films. So you were able to recreate some form of
Yeah,
work
well,
there
create it
with
really from scratch again after several years in college of not having it. And then growing that out in the world of films, at film festivals, meeting people, or just in New York at the movies. These are not exclusive things that only certain people have access to. It's not, oh, you need so many resources and so much money and so much this or that to have these people or to have these resources. It's like most people I know who I've worked with or who have helped me in some way or who have, inspired something, I just know from 15 years of being at the movies in New York. And obviously not every town has the same version of that, but there's something like that anywhere, that there is just a sort of reliable pocket of where the right people are to spend time with. But the advice is also like, I was never looking for something. Like I was never saying like, oh, I want to go to movies all the time so that I can meet people and then work with them. And then I can meet people who want to make things. And then I can find people. I was never looking for it. It was more just, I'm just here to enjoy myself and watch films, and everyone else is here to do the same. And then 2 years later, once you're friendly with somebody, you can say, I'm thinking of something creative, maybe we should talk about that. I never viewed any of these things as a means to an end. It was never, I want to work at this store so that I can meet people to make movies with. It was just, I want to work here so that I can talk about movies with people all day, every day. And then 2 years later, 3 years later, it was, oh, I work with somebody who has a great face and he should be in front of a camera. And someone who used to work here is a very skilled cinematographer. So I should be talking to him. And then we put all the pieces together. But it wasn't like, oh, this is a place where I can get what I need and I can just meet people who will help me. It was more like, I just want to be around all these people who like talking about things that I'm interested in. And somehow these become important collaborators without ever desiring that to be the end goal.
Could you talk a little bit about like some of the work you've done with the actors? Because you've also worked with certain actors over several films, and also the role of improvisation in your work with actors.
Well, it depends. I mean, it just has changed so much over the years. I mean, the 6 films that I've made, the 6 feature films, the first 2, Impolex and The Color Wheel are very much micro budget. It's what, like, in literature canon would be called juvenilia. Like, they're just the sort of short sketches before the substantial body of work. And there's a looseness to them that's partially by design because I was inspired by things that had a sort of loose, shaggy feel. And then that looseness is also just the kind of inherent amateur quality of people who have never done something before trying to do it. And it's not that it's the quality we were aiming for or something I was attempting to harness. It's just that's the only thing you can really tap into when you're 23, 24, 25, making a feature film for the first time or the second time. Some of the performers in front of the camera are doing this for the first time. Most of them are doing it for the first time. So it's just the sort of form and the performance style and the relationship to the written script only exists as a sort of result of the actual process, which in the case of something like that, those movies were made in 1 week and in 3 weeks. So they just have a quality in the finished product that is totally representative of how they were made. Which means, if I were making a movie now and we were shooting for 5 or 6 weeks with professional actors, it wouldn't look or feel like those movies. But it shouldn't, because we're not making it the same way. But if we took professional actors now and went and made a movie in one location in 7 days, like we did for Impolex, it would have a looseness to it. So the sort of journey through the films is just, they're always changing because the means by which they made are changing, but also I go from someone who has never executed something longer than 20 minutes to somebody that has made 3 or 4 films, and I know how to pace myself and see the whole thing through. And then the style of acting just gets so much more comfortable because for the third film, Listen Up, Philip, I had made 2 full films without a single professional actor, without a single person who, as a craft, could memorize a script and could come in with questions about it. I had made films with people who, if you're lucky, could mostly remember the word. And that what didn't matter. The qualities were different. The sort of looseness of those movies was different. Then moving into making things with people who do this for a living. And in many cases, I've been really fortunate to work with people who have done it for a long, long time. And then suddenly it's these small movies where it's everybody's first, second, or third film. And then suddenly you're working with people who have been doing this since before you were born, or people who've been doing this for 20 years. And the ability to tap into a different skill set from performances changes. I mean, that movie, everything learning about directing actors happened there because we had this huge ensemble of people that I'm just learning from their experience. And now I've gone from the early movies where my job as a director, or in the case of Color Wheel, which I'm also in front of the camera, is just keeping it together and keeping everybody on topic. Now my job as a director in these films is just listening to the actors and harnessing their own impulses and trying to understand what they're trying to help me see about the material. Because this is, again, I've still only made, these 6 films, and making something with, Jonathan Pryce or Jason Schwartzman or Elisabeth Moss and Listen Up, Philip, they've all made 30, 40, 50 films over the years. And I have not been on as many sets as a single actor that I've worked with, really. And that's a joy because everybody works more than me. And this applies to the actors who, could make 2 or 3 films a year, to the crew. I have gone from having people who had day jobs and maybe owned a camera or some sound gear as a hobby, to working with people in a camera department or a lighting department, could work 50 weeks a year on shoots. And I've done this 6 times, and you're working with a crew that, has probably worked on 75 or 80 films, 5 a year for 10 years, sometimes more, shorts, music
Yep.
videos, commercials for a day. And they've been on all these sets and they've learned so much that I've never learned. And the process of acting, kind of dealing with a growing crew as the films get bigger, is just realizing no matter how many films you direct, you'll always have the least experience being on set. No one works less than a director because everyone else has to work on things all the time.
Yeah.
And everything from the acting on down for me is always about just harnessing everyone else's experience.
Drawn from that, is there something either from the earlier films or from more recent films? Actually, the film of the day today in the UK is Listen Up, Philip.
Okay.
So it's great that we're talking today. It's also the only film of yours I've seen in a cinema.
Oh, great.
Could you like describe a scene or a moment in a film that you made where you actually had to overcome a challenge, or because you didn't have the experience, or maybe because it was just something that came up?
Yeah, I mean, it depends. There's little hiccups along the way, and largely I find that unless they somehow remain permanent in the actual image, that you don't, it's kind of hard to remember that day 7 was really bad unless it affects something that you end up looking at whenever you look at the movie. Like in Color Wheel, where most of the kind of end of what I guess is the second act of the movie is this party sequence that was shot over 2 days at overnights in an apartment, and it was just a challenge because it was conceived incorrectly from top to bottom, both logistically and creatively. To this day, I couldn't tell you why the decision was made to shoot overnights rather than just black out the windows, because now you have 15 people feeling physically ill and kind of not functioning at their best at 4, 5, 6 in the morning to shoot something that, yes, takes place at night, but it takes place inside at night. It's just an apartment. And if I could do one big thing on that movie over, it would be really think through that sequence and shoot it in the middle of the day with black board over the windows, which we never even really see. And then you just close the drapes. And it just, to make that decision sort of negatively impacted everybody's ability to do their job, mine especially, because overnights are really, really horrible to put people through unless it's like a week of them, but to only do it twice, it just didn't work. And you can see it when you look at the footage that it's just a bunch of people that are functioning at an incredibly low level of energy and focus because overnights are really bad. And this is also not a professional crew of people. If I did this now, I would have 50 people who they know when they do an overnight, they pace themselves the day before and they get on a sleep schedule. But that was just essentially a bunch of people who were friends who I said show up at this place at 10 p.m. That means they're just up all day. So there's always something. I do feel like the films after that had enough of a professional infrastructure that at worst, the headaches are just tiny little hiccups that you send somebody to deal with. The only thing that's even comes close is both present in the film and also kind of a blessing and irrelevant at the same time, is that the opening concert scene in Her Smell was shot the day before the finale scene in a huge venue that we only had 2 days in, one day to do the opening and one day to do the ending. So we were still there the second day, but we found out that the cameras that we were using, which were different than we had done for the rest of the shoot, had malfunctioned in some way that nobody at the lab who was looking at the footage could explain. And it became headaches and the ACs losing their minds over what happened. Everything seemed fine. Nothing was wrong in the apparatus. So the problem must have been invisible. And it just became a headache where we then had to shoot 2 of the biggest and most complicated scenes in the same day rather than one day and one the next day, because we had to reshoot the first scene after doing the other scene. And it was just, it took 2 bad days and made it 3 bad days, but squeezed into 2. And then the end result is that when we finally actually saw the complete footage, it looked great. And the camera error was creating a sort of visual effect that you couldn't create if you wanted to. It's like a sort of defective issue in the way the film moved through the camera that to the lab looked very wrong. And for many movies and many scenes in movies, including other scenes in this movie, would not have worked. But for the scene that it was and the style of opening the movie this way, it actually worked perfectly. And all of it was usable. And we used most of it in the movie and then continued using the defective camera on purpose for other scenes. So that was just like
That's an amazing
a
story.
real negative that affected everybody because it just doubled our workload on a day that was already probably the biggest and most logistically complex day. And then we had to finish that day and then do the entire previous day again. And then it turns out we didn't need to do that because the next day or later that night, even like 4 a.m. when we got home and the footage had been posted, it turns out it was better than it was a better accident than anything intentional could have been. So it was pretty shocking on a film of that size with that much infrastructure to have such a unexpected complication. But I guess that's what you get when you switch out your cameras in week 4 of a shoot for different cameras that you're only using for 2 days, is that you might get a defective camera.
which ended up being a sort of blessing in disguise.
Unexpectedly, but very positively.
Right. I don't know if you have watched films in the past year.
Yeah,
But
every day. I mean, there's nothing else to do.
I don't know. I saw that you just had a child. I mean,
Yes.
I mean, um,
The movies get paused a lot now, but
right.
very, very rarely still does she prevent anything from getting watched.
Yeah. Would you be able to tell us like your top 3 films of like the films you've seen the past year? Like they don't have to be new films.
Yeah. No, I
Could
mean, I can just bring up my list, scroll for some highlights, my sort of, I guess now this is the kind of thing that people have public. I know I still just keep it as a list, but I can just kind of look through it. At the very least, it's comprehensive. 3 films recently that I've rated extremely highly in my own estimation are Canal by Andre Vajda, Topsy Turvy by Mike Lee, and Europa Europa by Agnieszka Holland. And then just before that, Mr. Turner, also by Mike Lee, Ordinary People by Robert Redford, also ranked very highly here for me. Yentl by Barbara Streisand, ranked very highly here. All fairly recent movies that are a real cut above the rest.
Wow. And last question is about the most interesting piece of film industry news that you've heard recently.
Um, Interesting or
Well, I guess with the current state with festivals having to become, for example, hybrid digitally or
yeah. I don't know. I mean, yeah, it doesn't interest me because it's sort of all vaguely depressing at this point,
right,
certainly. But I'm maybe interested, if maybe not fully, but just sort of compelled in the way that these things have adapted, and the digital festival experience isn't something that I've participated in, but largely that's just because even like we were looking at some Sundance movies, and they're largely timed. And with a baby, we can watch something, but sometimes it'll take us like 4 hours to watch a movie, so we
yeah.
can't really like watch something that starts at a time and has a Q&A. But I guess the interesting thing for me is you see from some of the titles I say that we've watched, I do feel like there's, and certainly you're doing this, places presenting things in a logical way that replicates what at least people like me are used to seeing when you pick up a programming calendar from a movie theater. Streaming is roughly 10 years old. And it's very interesting to me that only now are people thinking there should be some rhyme or reason to what people's experience is when they look at this. And grouping movies by genre is not enough. Grouping them by, movies by the same filmmaker, or, this is what I saw when I first looked at MUBI. Here's 4 films by or here's 6 films from this festival, or here's, like this sort of, it's very exciting to me that finally, after 20 years of me just wiring my brain of how I want to watch things to the way places program them for me, to now have the streaming options at home programming them for me exactly the same. And I think this is a huge step in the right direction, because otherwise, like, you're just confusing people. If you want people to live within your curation, to me, it's just very obvious that you have to make it so that it makes sense to keep coming back. So every time you come back, it's confusing and different again. And the viewer has to sort of relearn where everything is from scratch. This is part of my big dream that someday, somehow, streaming sites will allow members to organize their own streaming queues however they want, which nobody does or has done yet. And I don't understand why that is. Not a single service does this, especially because, you look at the ability of something like Spotify to create playlists and how interactive that is, and even YouTube to create playlists. And yet not a single streaming service offers me the ability to say, here are my horror movies, here are my World War II movies, here are my new movies, here are my classical Hollywood. Like I just organizing my own viewing. Every music and everything else has sort of created this for people, but not movies. So I am very interested in the developing of the at-home experience in the last year has given like a big bang of people having to really think differently on how to do it. And I'm very curious to see what happens next.
Well, thank you so much. That
Yeah,
was
thank you for asking me to
like
do this.
really great insights.